Now, when you begin your debate, you're going to become an expert on one of these three topics, but it's still important for you to understand how all three of them impact the Great Lakes. I'm not going to go into a whole lot of specifics about the Great Lakes themselves, but I'm going to explain the problems and then potential corrections for those three topics: pollution, invasive species, and habitat loss. So in Section 4, you read about pollution, and in 1972, the Great Lakes Water Quality Agreement was signed, and some of the ways that they were able to prevent some of that pollution from entering the ecosystem was to pass laws that limited chemicals, because again, if you can point to the source, I can then monitor that company and see, are you releasing chemicals? If I test your water, am I going to find certain levels of chemicals that you're releasing? Also then encouraging companies to remove the phosphorus. Remember, that was that actual agent in the detergent creating all those soapy, sudsy bubbles. And if I could remove that from the detergent, then as the detergent gets washed into the water system, I'm not going to have that impact on algae growth. Limiting and or creating excessive fines for companies that are caught dumping toxic chemicals into the water system. And then also just banning any use of toxic chemicals, again, with fines that create an economic stress on companies that continue to pollute the environment. I want to make sure again that we understand the term runoff and the idea that runoff comes from not just farms and agriculture, but any chemicals that end up in our water supply through the drainage of water. So as your car just naturally leaks oil from your tires or anything on the street, and then a rain washes that into storm drains, that's creating pollution that then enters the water system as well. Fertilizing your yard to make your grass look all beautiful and clean, then also has that chemical effect of going into the soil and into the water system as well. Air pollution is a different type of pollution than water pollution, but it does impact the water cycle, because when things are burned and emitted into the air, remember that the air is also part of the water system as clouds create rain, and then the rain drops back onto the earth, and that water becomes a part of the water cycle again. Pointing out the idea that sediment is a particular kind of soil. This is the soil that settles at the bottom of rivers, oceans, lakes. And as that water contains a bunch of chemicals, those chemicals can then also seep into the soil at the bottom. And then that soil is where plants grow as well. And then also that toxic sediment can create a sludge that impacts the life source above it in the water. Main idea about pollution is that we have to be able to try and prevent it. It's much cheaper and much less impact on the environment to prevent pollution from entering the ecosystem than it is to clean it up once it's been introduced into the ecosystem. Invasive species, how do they get into this new area? Remember that most of them arrived by sea. In larger cargo ships, there's something called ballast water, and this is water that is in part of the cargo ship through the transportation process, through the loading and unloading, and so species will get into that ballast water, and then when a ship gets to a new port, they can release that ballast water, and then out go the species that were hitching a ride. You can also hitch a ride on the outside of ships, specifically recreational boats, and you can then take your boat out of the water, and if there's mussels or barnacles that are attached to your boat, if you're not careful and you don't clean those off, when you get into the water in a new lake, those can then come off and become a part of the new ecosystem. We actually see signs in our own waterways. If you've been to the Lake of the Ozarks or any of the local lakes here in Kansas and Missouri, there are always big signs that say, please clean your boats, make sure that you're on the lookout for zebra mussels. We don't want to bring these into our ecosystem. Also, a side note, when my husband and I went camping in Minnesota, we couldn't bring our own firewood. You had to have firewood that was from a local source. And you could buy it at the campground or at a local store because they didn't want species of trees or species of wood that was being burned or brought in because it could contain animals or mold spores. Sometimes we don't even think it has to be that big. Just could be an insect that hitched a ride in a piece of wood that you then bring to a new area and then can spread like wildfire. So what do invasive species do to the environment? That you think they're just plants and animals like any other plant and animal. However, the difference is that they can take up a lot of space. They can be a larger animal than was meant to be in that ecosystem, or they can eat a lot of food that would normally go to the native species, and then the native species run out of food in that food chain or that food web, and then that native species dies off. That can have a real negative impact on the environment. A similar idea is to think about when European settlers came to the Americas and brought diseases that the Native American peoples were not immune to. And so that created an invasive species of microorganism that then had a negative impact as well. So what can you do to prevent these? Obviously, making people aware. Making people understand that your boat can impact, your firewood can impact the environment. They can also put up barriers. They've actually put up fencing inside of the Great Lake to try and prevent fish from swimming into new areas. But then also an interesting idea is to promote predator species. And if you have too many of one kind of invasive species, well, what eats that species? And then investing money in that species of predator to try and control the population in a more natural way. Finally, we're going to look at habitat loss. And habitat loss is the ultimate destruction of the shelter, the food source, or the water source for a species. That includes humans as well. Actually, the arrival of people was the creation of habitat loss for the natural environment. We had settlers coming to the Great Lakes in the 1800s who were clearing forests for homes and farms. And while this makes sense for us as a human species, it was detrimental to the natural habitat for plants and animals that lived in the area. Later on, as the demand for housing increased, then you have the logging industry, and now we're cutting down huge patches of trees to use that lumber for the building of other products. Forests are one of the major sources of habitat loss because of all of the plants and animals that live in a forest ecosystem. However, we've developed lots of new techniques for less harmful logging and also then created incentives for replanting trees. Nice thing about trees is that they can grow again, and they have the ability to be replaced as long as the soil and the ecosystem is able to sustain them. But also additionally in the Great Lakes are this idea of a wetland ecosystem. And originally wetlands were seen as this pesky, wet, marshy, swampy area that humans didn't really like because it was smelly and messy. And so we then discovered that they're actually very important to the ecosystem because of the habitat that they provide for plants and animals. And so we've newly created preserves where we've limited the amount of human contact in an area so that the natural environment can occur without human interference. But then also part of that public awareness and education, teaching landowners how to take care of their own wetland areas. The challenge now becomes the population, and our planet is increasing in population exponentially. And when you talk about population challenges, the idea is that you're competing for resources, and you've got people and you've got the environment. And so the question is, it's not a win-loss, it's either a win-win or a lose-lose. So considering those population pressures, how are we going to preserve our environment at the same time support the habitat for human beings as well? So there's a lot going on in this chapter, and I'm looking forward to seeing the additional research that you come up with for the future impact of the Great Lakes, and are we going to be able to save this freshwater resource for North Americans and the plants and animal species that we depend on for our survival?